Welcome to 401 Notes. Let's get started. Our first key concept is congruent figures. In order for our congruent figures, we need to have corresponding angles be congruent and corresponding sides to be congruent. We can actually find all this out through our congruency statement. The very first letter is going to match with the very first letter of the second one. Notice A and E, these two are corresponding angles, meaning these two angles are going to be congruent. Okay? Just like we have corresponding angles, we're also going to have corresponding sides. So A and B is right next to each other, so we know side AB should be congruent to side EF. And if we look right here, it is. Remember, you guys are taking notes on this, so make sure you pause the video and copy everything down that you see right here. But all we're doing basically is saying if we have congruent polygons, all their corresponding parts and segments are congruent. Let's take a look at our other key concept from this lesson, which is the third angles theorem. This theorem right here basically states if A and D are congruent, then B and E are congruent, so we have two sets of congruent angles, we know the third set's going to be congruent as well. This is kind of similar to our triangle angle sum theorem, where we basically have all three angles have to add up to 180. For example, if I knew A was 50 degrees, then D would also have to be 50 degrees. And if I said E was, say, 30 degrees, then we know B would have to be 30. Well, the only answer for C and F would be 100 degrees. That's how we know the third angles theorem is going to work every single time. So make sure you, again, write this down. Whatever little notes I add to it, you can add at your discretion, but whatever's written, make sure it's done. All right, let's move on to our first example. Our first example, we're trying to find congruent parts, okay? What are the congruent corresponding parts? And when we're doing this, we're talking about angles and we're talking about sides, okay? So we're talking about those two things, and we want to use our congruent statement right here to help us identify. So I'm going to go ahead and use colors to identify these. But when we look at H, that's going to correspond to L. Again, we're using our congruency statement to help us out. When we're looking at I, we're going to correspond it to M. Again, I'm getting everything here from my congruency statement. And when I want J, I know it's going to correspond to N. And the last one is going to be KO because it's a knockout. Okay, that was my only joke for today, which is good because it's embarrassing. So what are the congruent corresponding parts? Like I said, we have our angles, but we also want to go ahead and take a look at our segments. And so let's look at a couple of them. We don't need to name all of them right now, but we can look at a couple of them. If I asked you what segment is congruent to HI, okay, we should be able to say it's the yellow and blue segment. So the yellow and blue segment over here would be LM. Not only can we look at those color matching, but we can look up here too. Do you see how HI was right there and LM was right there? Those two segments are going to be congruent. If I said HK, what congruent segment is that? Class, what segment would be congruent to HK? LO. By the way, this is 4th period class. Very highly intelligent and very talkative. But yeah, we have HK and LO. So I would go ahead and name all four sides and all four angles. And if we actually look at our solution, okay, and clear the page, we have all four sides shown congruent, all four angles shown congruent. So again, the congruency tells me which part corresponds with which part. Let's take a look at example 4. In this example, we're looking at how to prove triangles congruent. To prove triangles congruent, we need to prove 6 different things. Okay, we need to prove 3 angles and 3 sides. Okay, so let's make sure we write that down. I'm going to write that right here. 3 angles and 3 sides. Okay. If I can show those things, then I have congruent triangles. Well, if you take a look, I already have 2 sides congruent and I already have 2 angles congruent, so I really only have to prove a side and another side, and another angle, sorry. So let's go ahead and jump into this. Sometimes when we're doing this, they show us here that we can go ahead and show the triangles by separating them. Makes it a little bit easier to see. We can see that LN and LN are going to be congruent to each other. So like I said, you can separate the triangles to make it easier to see that LN and LN are going to be congruent to each other. And we got to show somehow that this angle N right here is going to be congruent to this angle N. So let's continue on moving down. And we want to start with our statements and reasons. Again, we need to prove 3 angles and 3 sides. Well, we start with our given statement that our 2 sides we already know are congruent. That was given to us. So we go ahead and showed LM and LO are congruent, NO and MN are congruent by given. We want to show that the next side is congruent. In order to do that, you can go ahead and state, hey, LN and LN are congruent. And how do I know LN is congruent to LN? Reflexive property is how we know. So if we go ahead and pause it right here, we can say, look at this. We've proved 3 sides right here, haven't we? So 3 sides, check mark, we got. Now we have to prove 3 angles to be congruent. Once I've proven the 3 sides of the 3 angles, my proof is done, correct? So let's continue on. Now I already know 2 of my angles are congruent because that was given to me. So I just got to show this last angle is congruent. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. I need to show that this angle right here is congruent to this angle there. Well, if we think back to our key concept, we remember if we have 2 angles congruent in the same triangle, the third angle is going to be congruent. That's that third angle's theorem. Okay, so we're going to imply or use that MNL and ONL are going to be congruent by the third angle's theorem. So again, that was a key concept for us. All right, again, pausing it here, these 2 statements show 3 angles are congruent. So now we have 3 sides and 3 angles. We can now finish the proof off, so we can use this piece right here and finish essentially the proof by putting in the proof. Okay, they're showing that all the pieces are congruent. Okay, and now we can say, hey, triangle LMN and triangle LON are congruent, and that's the definition of congruent triangles. A congruent triangle will have 3 congruent angles and 3 congruent sides. Alright guys, that is all. Hasta luego from me and from period 4. Say goodbye everybody.